TribCast is brought to you by members of the Texas Tribune. Hello and welcome to the Texas Tribune TribCast for December 2nd, 2025. I am Matthew Watkins, editor-in-chief of the Texas Tribune, joined as usual by Eleanor Klibanoff, law and politics reporter.
Very
Hello,
good.
Eleanor.
Hello, thank you for having me.
I got a little bit unsure there, but I got through.
Yeah.
We are joined this week by K-12 reporter Jaden Edison. Hey, Jaden.
Greetings. Hello. How are y'all?
We were discussing in the newsroom how great this sweatshirt looks on you.
I appreciate it.
It is a sweater TribCast.
It's a sweater TribCast.
All of us are wearing
If you're not watching on YouTube, this is one to watch on
Yeah.
YouTube. We look so cozy.
Anybody in Texas is just waiting on this weather so we can pull out our winter fits. You know,
100%.
yeah.
Exactly. Also joining us and also in a sweater is David Feigen, Director of Early Learning Policy with Texans Care for Children. Hello, David.
Hey, good to see y'all, and I was delighted to see you all also in sweaters. I didn't know how I was going to dress for this, but I feel good. I feel welcome, and I feel cozy, so ready to talk.
Wonderful. David, the first TribCast guest to have played basketball with me.
Oh, wow.
Wow.
So.
Who won? Was it 1-on-1, 5-on-5? What was the
5-on-5. It was an old game back in the
Okay.
day. A game started by former Texas reporter, now for the New York Times, Brian Rosenthal.
Okay.
We would play a weekly Sunday game. Game's still going on, although David left us.
He quit.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, the invite stopped coming. I think maybe I played too well or something, but
Yeah. The standard was too high.
Right.
Yeah.
yeah, I get
I
it.
love
I
getting
don't want to embarrass anybody.
Yeah. Yeah. We'll move on.
Let's keep it polite, guys.
Maybe someday we'll have Rob Downen on the show, and we
Yeah.
can talk about my vicious block of him and the one time
wow.
that he played in that game too.
He still talks about it.
Yeah.
Yes.
That's why he left the Texas Tribune, actually.
It is, yes,
Yeah.
because I kept bringing it up.
Yeah.
Yes. But that's not what we're talking about today,
Right.
although
Yeah.
maybe we can talk a little bit more about it.
Yeah, we'll see
here.
where the conversation takes
Yeah.
us.
Instead, we are going to talk about early childhood care, early learning, a topic near and dear to the hearts of many working parents, such as myself and David, as we were talking about earlier before we started on. If you are a parent in Texas where both parents work, you know about the challenges of finding adequate care for your children. I remember when I was in Dallas when we had our first kid, one of the first things you are told as a soon-to-be parent is you better get on a child care wait list as soon as possible. Many of the places in Dallas at the time, the wait list was more than 9 months. So you actually needed to get onto the wait list when you were thinking about having a kid, not even when you found out you were going to have a kid. The problem, even worse in rural areas or for low-income Texans, I am going to cite a stat that is from David that says that 88% of working families with low incomes live in child care deserts, where demand is 3 times greater than the availability of high-quality child care seats. 2 notable things happened this legislative session in this regard. The first one being the legislature approved $100 million toward child care scholarships in an effort to shrink the nearly 95,000 member waiting list for those scholarships. The money was spent. The waiting list did not shrink, thanks in large part to increased childcare costs. We'll get into that here in a little bit. Second, the state voted a little bit more not under the radar politically, but under the radar toward this issue to approve a $1 billion school voucher program. It was designed and touted as a way to use state dollars to help kids pay for their private school tuition. But what was not discussed as much was that the vouchers can also be used for private pre-K, something that the comptroller confirmed last week. So that could be a major change. But I want to start first with you, David, on this scholarship issue. Lay out for me, first of all, just what this program was and how it works, just, how it has worked over the years.
So the Child Care Services Program is managed by the Texas Workforce Commission, and it does so because it helps parents go to work. And the Workforce Commission is proud to have this as the largest line item of its budget is supporting this program. It provides financial aid, also known as scholarships or subsidies, to eligible families who meet work and income requirements, have a child under the age of 13. It gives them financial assistance so that they can go to work and their children can thrive in really high quality childcare programs. There's about 30,000 Texas employers right now who have somebody working there who's there because they have access to one of these scholarships. So we know this is a really important program for the Texas economy and for Texas families. The funding has primarily come from the federal government, the Child Care and Development Block Grant that Congress provides, but states around the country have infused additional dollars to serve more families. Prior to last session, Texas was not one of those states. Texas took the federal money, spent it, but did not add in any state dollars to serve more parents. We were excited that last session that changed, and as you said, 100 million new dollars got invested into this program to serve more families, and we're excited that that win happened, that it was bipartisan. But as we'll talk about, there's a lot more work to do to actually serve more families and bring down the very long wait list for that program, which sits at around 100,000 kids.
Yeah, can you talk a little bit about just the discussion about this during the legislative session? I mean, I gave sort of my own personal experience at the top of the show, but what was it a reflection of the child care problems in Texas that led to this larger infusion of cash? And how was that problem discussed among lawmakers and people who came to the Capitol to advocate for this?
Well, I have been working on this issue in earnest really since 2017 or so. And I've sort of watched the journey of this in the Texas legislature where back then the conversation around childcare was almost exclusively on ensuring minimum health and safety standards were met by childcare programs. It was, you guys might recall a big expose that was done by the Austin American Statesman around children who had died in childcare programs, and that led to a series of reforms to try to crack down on unlicensed care. There was some efforts to improve the nutrition standards in childcare. But over the last few years, there's really been a shift where lawmakers have understood, we have a role too in actually ensuring families can afford high quality childcare, that the childcare that they can afford is not just safe, but supporting children's school readiness. And so going into session for really the first time, it was very clear that childcare was on the agenda. Both the House and Senate held interim hearings trying to tackle ways in which we can address this during the session. In my time, the Senate had never had a hearing on this topic during the interim. And so we knew that it was going to be a big priority. We didn't know how that would manifest. And we worked with partners to really bring up this issue of the wait list, that there's children who are eligible for this program but are waiting for 6 months to 2 years because of the lack of funds. This is not a program where every child who's eligible gets served. There's a certain number of scholarships we fund, and after that, you have to wait for somebody to come off the program. And so there are families waiting because we don't have enough funds. We told the stories not just of families who were struggling, but the families who actually benefited from this program. We talked to a mom who was literally homeless before she got access to one of these scholarships. She was able to work a couple hours a week cleaning houses with her baby strapped to her because she had no childcare. She eventually got a scholarship. Now she's working full time. She's housed, and her child is in a really high quality program here in Austin. And we were able to tell stories like that and say, look at all of this program is achieving. Don't we want to see more Texas families benefit in the ways that these parents have? And so, we also told the stories of, frankly, lots of Republican-led states around the country who had lapped Texas and was really investing. And so between that, I think we were able to make a winning case that investing in this program is research-based, it's popular, it's something we can do very simply in serving more parents. And so we were able to get that win. And I will say that the leadership of Representative Armando Wally was really key, and as well as the Speaker of the House and the Appropriations Senate Finance Chairwoman and Chairman. So it was a big bipartisan win for sure.
There were two things I sort of want to get your read on as like what shifted this conversation and moved childcare into the more like mainstream political conversation here. One being, the thing I covered for a long time, which was the, ban on abortion and sort of this attention that Republican lawmakers sort of felt called to address, women's health issues, supporting families, sort of making good on some of these promises that they brought to bear, which sort of I've sort of seen that play out over the last couple of years. The other one being, though, that I'm not as clear on is like the COVID pandemic and the way like that sort of felt like suddenly we were all talking about childcare in a way we hadn't been before.
Yeah, you're totally right. I mean, it's not just in Texas. There was, we wrote a policy brief around, as I mentioned, how different Republican-led states have addressed this issue. And what you'll find is a lot of their big investments came right on the heels of, right after the pandemic sort of began in 2021 or in 2023. And so there has been an explosion of attention on this. I think there's a few reasons. One is the need for childcare became quite clear to people, many of whom were home with their kids all day. If their childcare program had to close or, they had to take time off work to be with their kids at home, I think the need for childcare became very visible. The other thing that I think was really important was the federal government, under both the first Trump administration and the Biden administrations, invested significant federal dollars into states to stabilize childcare. And what we found was that worked. It turned out that spending a lot of money to ensure that programs can retain staff, that they can receive funding so they don't have to increase costs on parents, that's a very popular and effective way to help families go to work. So a lot of states saw, once those federal dollars ran out, said, what can we do to fill the gaps? And I think that it essentially served as an unintentional pilot program where states got to see, hey, if we invest money into these programs, we can get really good returns. And I think that's essentially opened the valve of investments that we're now seeing across the country.
Yeah, it's I think also worth at least making the point that there has been a political shift. There's been a willingness to invest more money on this. It was $100 million, which is a big investment. The state did spend $51 billion on reducing property taxes this year. So there's something about the priorities there. But it's also worth pointing out that as your report on this, David, noted, that this money was, not actually state money that was being added to this. It was unspent federal dollars from the Temporary Assistance for Needy Families program. That basically there was this pot of money that Texas had that had sort of decided not to spend, not to find a use for, and then they kind of decided, oh, maybe we should use it to boost this scholarship program.
That's right. Yeah, it took quite a journey. The House passed in its budget $100 million of state dollars that it evolved into, as you say, these unexpended TANF funds. Our opinion on this, frankly, is that the parents who will benefit won't really know the difference, that it came from an unspent TANF pot or an unspent general revenue pot. I think that the point is lawmakers found a way to make this investment. And we know that, states across the country are using TANF dollars for this purpose. So it's not a stretch to say that this is a really valid use of those dollars when we have them. I think that moving forward, we should look at that unspent TANF pot as a way to fund this program, but also state general revenue and continue to explore other revenue streams, because this problem is significant. This is not something that is a one session fix or even one funding stream strategy. We have to figure out how to make investments at the state level, the local level. Philanthropy is going to continue to play a role. It's going to take a lot of resources to really get this problem addressed.
Yeah, you're sort of addressing what was going to be my next question, which is how much of the need is this filling? How much of this is moving the needle in terms of the child care challenges in the state? I mean, you talk about a wait list of 95,000 kids. I would imagine there's a lot more families that, are struggling to pay for childcare in Texas.
Yeah, no question. I mean, maybe I'm burying the lead a little, that, we hoped that this investment, because of estimates that were provided by the Texas Workforce Commission during the legislative session, would essentially allow us to serve around 10,000 more children in the program. That was their estimates during the legislative session. However, after the legislative session, the Workforce Commission partners with the University of Texas, who conducts a survey to essentially figure out how much each of these scholarships costs. And that's based on the market rate of childcare. And what they unfortunately found was childcare costs are continuing to skyrocket. And what that means is that the cost of scholarships skyrockets. And it's a simple math equation. If each scholarship costs more, you can't provide as many without increasing the amount of funds. So this $100 million was just as essential as we thought it would be. Unfortunately, though, it was to prevent a reduction of the number of scholarships rather than to serve more families. So, in fact, the urgency was actually even greater than maybe we presented during the legislative session, that we were actually at risk of having to serve fewer children in this program. Fortunately, lawmakers came together to make this investment, but it's a reminder that we have so much more work to do to actually serve more parents in the program.
So if $100 million sort of held the line or prevented, this program from taking a step back, is there like a dollar amount you guys see that would, like, what would it cost to make that wait list zero?
Our goal has not been to make the wait list zero. I think that, even during the legislative session, we really tried to convey that the goal is to serve more families. We can increase the wait list just by doing a better marketing campaign, right? And that doesn't necessarily, but if we're serving more families, I think that's really the goal. So for us, I think we need to take this, one step at a time and understand that it's going to take a number of years, it's going to take the state level, the federal level, the local level to really address this problem in earnest. It's going to take us providing more funding for scholarships, but also doing more to bring down the cost of childcare so that this cost for scholarships doesn't continue to rise. Childcare programs are facing increased costs across the board, and parents are bearing the brunt of that right now. So we need to be able to tackle this one step at a time. I think we made good progress this legislative session, but lawmakers, I hope, are getting used to talking about this issue because it's not a one session conversation, unfortunately. There's a lot more work to do.
Before we move on, can you just clarify, just to make sure I understand it correctly, who's eligible for this program? How do you get it?
Yeah, so it's based on income. It's essentially 85% of state median income, right? And you have to have a child under the age of 13. You have to be working or in job training. So there are work requirements and there are income requirements. We also prioritize scholarships based on a number of factors, including if you have a child with a disability, or the legislature also passed a bill this session that actually, if you're a child of a child care educator, that you're part of this priority list. So we have priorities among those eligible children, but 85% of state median income is what that main eligibility is. So a lot of families are eligible, but unfortunately, the number of scholarships far does not meet the demand.
I would imagine there's a lot of families that don't even know that this program
like
exists.
Like you said, you could double the wait list probably with a good marketing campaign.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Exactly. Okay. Let's pause for a second to hear from our sponsors. Then I want to bring Jaden in to talk about the school voucher angle to this. You can give every Texan access to reliable information by giving news this Giving Tuesday. Your donation strengthens public service reporting. Give now at texastribune.org/donate. All right, Jaden. So we talked about $100 million toward these scholarships through the Texas Workforce Commission. Of course, 10 times that amount was allocated toward school vouchers. The big brunt of that conversation, the big conversation among lawmakers, advocates of this, was that this is needed for, parents who have their kids in public schools, over the age of 5, who maybe are unhappy or not being served well by those schools, wanting to get state help to go to private schools. Less discussed was the issue that has now come up since the state comptroller has been in charge of setting the rules for how this money will be dispersed, and that is money that goes to 3- and 4-year-olds to go to pre-K programs, particularly private pre-K programs that are run all across the state. Tell us a little bit about that discussion and where the state landed on the issue.
Yeah, so I think it's important to understand kind of the process and the way things have played out, right? So the law passes, which obviously sets the framework for kind of how this is supposed to work. Now the comptroller, Texas chief financial officer, is tasked with, hey, here's the law, here's the framework now. Put this into action, design kind of a set of basically rules that will allow, parents to be able to understand, for example, what kind of documentation you need to submit, how certain processes will work, things that it kind of gets into the details in a way that the law doesn't, right? And so what we've seen since the passage of the law was very much that process, right? There was the introduction of proposed rules, and also a public comment period for people, Texans all across, to offer their insight and say, hey, here's what we like, what we don't like, what you should change, what you shouldn't. And so what's happened in that process is that during the public comment period, there were about roughly 200 to 300 comments, right? And we reviewed all the ones we could get, right, with about 200 or so. And what we kept seeing was the overwhelming majority of those comments seemed to be from private pre-K providers who were saying, hey, comptroller, you seem to have made a mistake, right? And what we're seeing in the rules that you proposed was that private pre-K, families, or pre-K families in general, you kind of allocated and put them in the bucket of $2,000 per student, which under the law is actually designated for homeschool students. And what the argument was is that, hey, the law is pretty clear. Pre-K students are eligible for the full roughly $10,000 amount that you set aside for everybody else outside of homeschool. And so basically it went through that process. And we arrived at, where we did in last week, basically, which was the comptroller, after going through the process, going through the law, and honestly hearing from the bill authors as well, basically setting in stone that, hey, you guys are right. It is the full $10,000 amount. And as long as students kind of meet what are currently the free public pre-K requirements, they're eligible for the full $10,000 amount. Now, and just for clarification, for free public pre-K, it's more of kind of a, for students, for example, who are on free or reduced lunch, students who, are not fluent in English per se. If you're a child of a public school teacher or, someone in the military, right, you'd be eligible. So there is a more kind of tight framework around that. But basically, that's kind of how we landed at where we are now.
Yeah, I mean, I remember being a parent, right, and seeing my kid daycare and being sort of shocked at the idea of I'm paying more in daycare tuition than I would be paying to send my kid for tuition to go to a state university in the state, right? Like this is a massive cost. And I think this idea, I can certainly see why a lot of daycares, a lot of people would be saying, like, if you can make this $10,000 available to us, admittedly, pre-K is only a couple of years in that 3 to 5 year, kindergarten time. That's a major benefit opportunity for families, upper middle class families, but especially lower income families and things like that. What was the argument? Did they explain why they initially proposed spending less for those parents?
Yeah, you know what? It's interesting because there was a lot of conversation about this. I really don't think it was anything like intentional per se, right? I think what happened was, and that's why you kind of have the rulemaking process, was that, this was their interpretation. And really, when you go back and look at the law, like, if you're looking for it, it is clear to say, right, pre-K, 10K. But if you were, to the average person just kind of glancing through, unless you were specifically looking for that, it maybe wouldn't be something that's the most apparent. And so and the comptroller has been very clear, acting comptroller Kelly Hancock, he said publicly, right, like, we're going to follow the intent of the law. And so it wasn't necessarily a surprise to me that they changed it to the full 10,000. I always expected that would be the case. And I just think that this was just a situation where you go through the rulemaking process and, you had Representative Brad Buckley and then former Senator Creighton, who's now Texas Tech Chancellor, who submitted written testimony and said, hey, here's kind of, just to clear up any confusion, here's what we were intending with this. And then throughout the process, they made the adjustment. And so, again, I don't think it was anything that was like intentionally, we want it to be this. It just seemed to be more, again, from my perspective, that there are so many aspects of the law. And so the rulemaking process allowed them to kind of get it right as intended.
There's always sort of that period. I mean, I think it comes up often in like more controversial ways than this, but where what the legislators wrote into the law and how the people on the ground actually have to enact it. Sometimes it's like they're not necessarily seeing all of the potential roadblocks, and then putting it into action, you're like, oh, okay. We have to like not change the law, but look at what the intent was at the time. Yeah,
and I tell you, that was the one thing I was looking at with the rules, right, was how much will the comptroller on any issue, right, deviate from what the law says, right? The law sets a foundation. Is the comptroller in a way going to go above and beyond kind of what that says, right? And so that's why I kind of land at the conclusion that I have, because really on a number of issues, the comptroller made clear, and the way they actually structure, the final rules, the office offered like detailed commentary to almost like each comment submitted and explained its rationale for, hey, here's why we're going to decline or accept this suggestion. And again, it I think it was pretty clear. They made it clear that, hey, here's here's what the law says, here's what the bill author says, so we'll follow that.
Yeah, I was just so struck when I learned about this kind of pre-K option about this, and my reaction. I had a few different reactions. I'm going to sort of like throw them out there to y'all to get you to react to. The first one was just, why didn't they talk about this when they were passing the bill? Because when knowing that it's available for private pre-K, it feels to me like it opens up the pool of people who could benefit from this so much larger than it was before, right? I'll just, again, bring my own experience into this. My kids go to public school. We're happy with our public school. We don't have any intentions of pulling them out of their public school. But my kids went to private pre-K, right? And we would have been thrilled to join that. I would imagine that there's a lot of parents in that position now who maybe have no plans on sending their kids to private school, but are going to send their kids to the church down the street, or some other kind of private, not associated with the school's system for pre-K, who now might get significant help from this. So just a little bit of confusion.
It's a broader coalition.
Yeah, why didn't you get those people on your side when you were advocating for this bill? But then also, does this not create any concerns for the people who were advocating for this, of we just dramatically increased the number of people who are going to want to have access to this program in a way that it's going to be a lot more competitive, and that $1 billion we already knew it was going to disappear pretty quickly. Now maybe it will disappear even quicker than that.
Yeah, well, I think if that were to happen, the state would totally welcome that outcome, right, in terms of the demand. And I think, the expectation is that, demand forward will go above what the appropriations are, and so the different priorities will kick in and things of that nature. I mean, I will say the one thing with the way they structured it is that, like, it's not, just a mom and pop kind of pre-K provider can pop up, right? It does require that, what are called education service providers. So in this case, whoever the pre-K provider is, right, does kind of follow the existing requirements for private pre-K providers, which could be, for example, I think it's accreditation with the state. That I wrote a couple down as well. It was like good standing with the Department of Family and Protective Services, different partnerships with, a lot of them have existing partnerships with districts and things of that nature. So the framework that already exists for private pre-K providers is also the framework that, those who, want to, take part in this program are also going to have to follow. But it's also, to your point, it is interesting. I don't have the magic answer as to why they didn't talk about it as much. I mean, there were so many different aspects, and you would think too it would have been a talking point given like a lot of the talk about public school pre-K funding, right? Yeah. Which is that's a whole nother conversation, that we could have. We could have a whole hour-long discussion, about that. But it was interesting, and again, it was one of those things that unless you were specifically looking for it in the law, it wouldn't have been apparent to you, because I think a lot of the focus from lawmakers was on homeschool students, right? It was two categories, right? Mm-hmm. You're the average student who's going to get the average kind of $10,000, or the up to $30,000 if you're a student with an IEP, a student with a disability, and then the separate bucket for homeschool students. And so it wasn't kind of apparent again until you go through 200, 300 comments, and literally. Clearly, the private pre-K providers knew about this because and they all copied and pasted the same messaging across the board. So clearly, it was a very coordinated effort, and everybody kind of was in the know on kind of what was happening.
Yeah. The other thing, my other reaction to this was, wow, this has sort of stealthily become the biggest state investment in these childcare issues. Yeah. Topics that we've seen. I'm curious, David, what your reaction to my reaction to that is. Like, am I right in thinking that that's possibly the case? How do you feel about this scenario?
Yeah, it's going to be really interesting because, and you asked the question of why this wasn't a bigger topic during the session, and I do think this is something we run into in early childhood education all the time, which is anytime it's a K through 12 discussion and pre-K has implications, these sorts of issues pop up because the way we govern our pre-K program, if you're a parent of a child of a 4-year-old, your access points to education are very different than when you're a parent of a 5-year-old. When you're a parent of a 5-year-old, you have access to a universal kindergarten program that is available in every corner of the state for free. If you have a 4-year-old, there are some families who are eligible for free pre-K, but many families are on their own and they are looking at private options because there's not a public option available to them. I think it's really worth re-emphasizing what Jaden said, which is the ESA program is universal, but for pre-K it's not. It's still only those families who are eligible for public pre-K, those who are on free and reduced lunch or meet one of the other eligibility criteria. So there's going to be a lot of parents who are parents of 4-year-olds who think, great, I have access to financial aid for pre-K, which these families really need because they don't necessarily have a public school option right now, but they're not going to be eligible for this. It's just those who are part of existing pre-K eligibility. So I think we really need to watch and see how many families actually are able to navigate that, because these other grades don't have the as restrictive of eligibility criteria. There's going to be a lot of implementation questions here. One of the ways that you can be eligible for free pre-K is to be a child whose home language is not English. That's done through a home language survey by the school district. How is that going to be done with an ESA? We don't know yet. We haven't seen guidance on that yet. So I think that there's a lot of questions about how many children actually will ultimately end up being served that are 4-year-olds and 3-year-olds. I think that the demand is certainly significant, as we've seen from the Child Care Services Program. A lot of parents want access to financial aid for early childhood education. I think we don't know how many of them are going to end up with ESAs, but I would remind folks that the Child Care Services Program is a financial aid program for parents to access childcare as well, and it has a much more generous eligibility than the ESAs do. So we're going to have to see how all these puzzle pieces fit together, but we're curious to see how many families benefit.
It made me think of something that David was saying earlier. We were talking about the scholarship, right, and sort of the awareness, right. Anytime, I think we all know this, right, when you've seen kind of these big programs that specifically target low income families, one of the big hurdles, as was acknowledged here, is the awareness component.
Yeah.
And it'll be interesting to see if that changes at all here, right. I think one of the things that voucher advocates had talked about, one of the benefits they saw in this program was that, hey, we actually have a whole year to get the word out about all the different benefits of it in ways that a state like Tennessee, for example, they passed their law and they were ready to roll, soon after. Again, I don't know how much that's going to change. I think ultimately what you'll see is, which we see, with these huge universal programs, is that especially in these early years, you're going to see those, like, for example, you had all these private pre-K providers who had testified and said, hey, this isn't right. Those are probably going to be the providers who go to families who will qualify and say, hey, if you don't know about this, hey, this is a benefit you can have, right? So initially you'll probably see, the students who ultimately benefit from it will be those who already in some way are connected to people who are kind of in the know. Yeah. And it'll be a challenge for the state over time with the entire program, with the awareness component, like we see with all these other programs as well.
Absolutely. Okay, I want to test one more reaction with you, David, which is one
you
thing
should
that
not have another kid to try to get this.
Right.
Like, that's your question.
Yeah. Don't worry.
Okay.
That is not my reaction at all.
Great.
Yes. One thing we haven't talked about much lately is this. We've talked a lot about the financial struggle for parents. We haven't talked as much about the financial struggle for these actual daycare centers. Again, citing your report, child care programs are operating on barely sustainable profit margins. You say typically less than 1%, which puts them at considerable risk of closure. That is even though child care educators are paid on average around $12 per hour with little to no benefits. The challenge here, one of the issues that I have heard about as I have been an interested person in this subject, is the idea of the battle for 3 and 4-year-olds, right? One of the things that happens is in daycare facilities, it's much more expensive to care for the infants than it is to care for the 3 and 4-year-olds, because the infants need more attention. They're less able to sort of, obviously take care of themselves. You need more adults per child in that area. There has been a push, a very well-intentioned push, to get more 3 and 4-year-olds into public pre-K. But what that does is it takes away the sort of profit generators for the daycare operators. and leaves them only having to care for, or care for a higher percentage of infants compared to 3 or 4-year-olds, which either forces them to lose revenue, go out of business, or increase their prices for the infants and everything like that. Does this create a situation where maybe you can pull some of those 3 and 4-year-olds back into these private daycare providers, which can make them more financially sustainable or allow them to make infant care more affordable for, the general population? What do you think about that possibility, David?
Yeah, I mean, I do want to just speak quickly about, your point about the struggle that childcare providers are facing, because it is significant. Again, that is why the scholarship costs are going up. They're facing rising labor costs. They're paying around $12 per hour, but they're losing staff to Buc-ee's and Amazon and all sorts of places. So they have to try to compete, which means those costs go up, and that means parents pay more. They're rising food costs. If childcare program provides food, we all can look at our grocery bill and see that that's going to affect childcare providers. Insurance is crushing right now. So childcare programs are facing rising insurance costs. Rent, property taxes, they face that as well. And parents are bearing the brunt of all of those increases, right? And so just like we would never rely on tolls to pay for our entire highway system, relying on just parents to pay for the full brunt of early care and education leads to these really unfortunate outcomes that we see. And so I understand deeply the pain that childcare providers are feeling and the hope that these opportunities give. I would say about just, the idea that we need to consider pulling, folks from these public settings and ensure that they return to private settings. First of all, I think it's important to remind us why they choose these public settings, which is that they can afford them. And I think we want to make sure that families can afford high quality options in a variety of settings, whether that be a Head Start program, a childcare program, a for-profit, nonprofit. We also want to make sure parents, if they want to keep their kid at home, have the resources to do that. And the public school is in many cases a good option for them. I also think it's important to remember that only about half of 4-year-olds in our state are enrolled in public pre-K. So there are plenty of 4-year-olds to go around. And I think we should make sure that they can afford and access these high quality programs. And many of them will choose private options if they have the ability to. And for 3-year-olds, I will say it's even less. It's only around 11% of 3-year-olds are enrolled in public schools. So there's plenty of children. I don't think it has to be a competition between these settings. I think we can do more to make childcare and preschool more affordable, more high quality across settings. And I think the legislature took some promising steps, but yeah, we have a lot more work to do.
Can I ask one quick question? David, I'm curious, like, to you, and one of the things I've heard, though, about the pre-K thing is just the general concern. It's almost like an optic conversation, right, where it's like, even after this legislative session, the state still isn't funding public pre-K at a full day level, right, which I know has been some of the concern of advocates and whatnot. And so you're going to have some who come out and say, well, clearly, if the will is there, you can get it done because you've set aside money now for private pre-K providers, to be able to benefit from this. How do you look at that kind of argument and that kind of debate that folks will have inevitably?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a lot of, like I said, I think from a parent's perspective, the way we do things doesn't seem to make a lot of sense. If you have a 4-year-old, you are lost in trying to figure out what is an option for you and your family. You're trying to figure out how to cut costs to afford this. Do you quit? Just one of you quit your job so that you can just stay at home with your kid because the costs for care are so expensive? But then the moment your child turns 5, it's like, okay, great. Now I have a universal program that I can enroll in. I think that a parent of a 4-year-old and a parent of a 5-year-old feel like their needs are similar, but the way the state responds is quite different, whether they be in public schools or not. So I think whether you're a superintendent or a child care program director, you have a lot to say that, hey, the state needs to do way more than we're doing, and we are ready to play a role in helping provide those high quality options for families, because I really just don't think that I think the competition that gets presented between these sites is really missing the mark. Like, I think everybody's struggling to meet the needs of these families because we're not investing enough in families' ability to access these programs. So our perspective at Texans Care for Children is that we want families to be able to afford and access private settings, public settings, and we want them to have the resources to figure out what best meets their family's needs.
Well, I think we found the solution here. You mentioned that, the employees can get better wages at Buc-ee's, and I think we just need to put childcare in all the Buc-ee's,
Yeah.
right?
Yes.
They're in rural areas.
Right, they're everywhere.
Very
Yeah.
popular, yeah.
And building new ones every day.
Exactly. All right. Great job, everybody.
Yeah, we solved it.
Appreciate you.
Yeah.
Well, I think thank you so much, David, for I think what has been a really informative discussion. Thank you as well to Jaden and Eleanor. Thank you to our producers, Rob and Chris. And thank you to our sponsors, the Texas Tribune membership program, texastribune.org/donate to keep this podcast and all of our journalism free and available to anyone who wants to access it. We'll be back next week.